You're recording. This morning's scripture is taken from Matthew chapter 14. Matthew 14. Immediately before this story, Jesus has found out that John the Baptist has been executed. John had denounced the behavior of Herod Antipas, the tetrarch who had inherited a fourth of the kingdom of his father Herod the Great. And John had denounced his behavior in taking as his wife his sister-in-law, which is not a good thing to do. And Herod had wanted to silence John, but he apparently actually enjoyed hearing John preach. He didn't even mind being told what a terrible person he was, because John was such a compelling speaker. He just didn't want to change anything about what he was doing or how he was behaving. But he was perfectly fine to be told how terrible he was on a regular basis. Until at his birthday, Herod had made a drunken and foolish promise, and the request from the person he'd promised was the head of John the Baptist. And he was more concerned about looking bad in front of his guests and not keeping a promise than he was about killing an innocent person. So he had done that. And word had come to Jesus that this had happened. And after hearing this, beginning at verse 13, now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a deserted place by himself. But when the crowd heard it, they followed him on foot from the town. When he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion for them and cured their sick. When it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a deserted place, and the hour is now late. Send the crowds away, so that they may go into the villages and buy food for themselves." Jesus said to them, "They need not go away. You give them something to eat." They replied, "We have nothing here but 5 loaves and 2 fish." And he said, "Bring them here to me." Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and blessed and broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples. And the disciples gave them to the crowds. And all ate and were filled. And they took up what was left over of the broken pieces, 12 baskets full. And those who ate were about 5,000 men, besides women and children. In February of 1970, my parents' marriage broke up. I was 10 and in the 5th grade, and I was unaware that there was a problem. I found out since that the problems were of, in some ways, 13 years standing, and in other ways, just a couple of years standing, but I didn't know about it. I was not clued in on what was happening. I wasn't noticing, or maybe didn't even have the capacity to notice the problems. So it was a bombshell to me, if not to them. And there were other issues. There were other problems. My father had been the music minister at Broadmoor Baptist Church in Jackson. And certainly in 1970, if your marriage breaks up, you lose your job. You lose your career. You have to find something else to do to make a living. We were living in a house that belonged to Broadmoor Baptist Church. It was the house for the minister of music. And the minister of music wasn't living there anymore. His wife and children were, but he wasn't. But the church was gracious and generous and allowed us to continue living there through the end of the school year. There were other issues. My mother had been an elementary school teacher, and there were two issues with that. One was that she didn't really like it very much. She did it, but she didn't like it very much. And the other was that back then, an elementary school teacher got paid for 9 months. But rent was going to be due for 12 months. And we were expecting to eat for 12 months. So, in that summer, the summer of 1970, we moved to an apartment in the Fondren neighborhood of Jackson. Now, this was way before the Fondren neighborhood was the hip and happening neighborhood of Jackson. It was just a place with houses. And we got an apartment that was the top floor of a house. There was another apartment on the basement floor. 3 bedrooms. And my mother began school at the medical records program at the University of Mississippi Medical Center. And so for that school year, she was not going to have a job. So my grandmother helped a little bit. My father helped a little bit, but things were tight. And often, toward the end of the month, there'd be no food, and there was also no money. And so we began an activity some of you may have done. Back in the olden days, I'll call them, in the 1970s, soft drinks, Cokes and other such, came in glass bottles, and the glass bottles were returned to the grocery store, where they would pay you 5 cents per bottle. And the bottles would go back to the bottler, who would sterilize them and put the drinks in again. It was recycling before we knew to call it recycling. It was kind of direct recycling. And some of you may have done this, but we would go around Fondren and look for discarded soft drink bottles. I guess since we were in Mississippi, we'd call them Coke bottles, whether they had Coke or Pepsi or Dr. Pepper. It's just that kind of, it's Coke. You know, what kind of Coke do you want? Sprite? That's how you answer that in Mississippi. But we would collect the bottles. And I'm told that I was the best one at spotting them. I've always been fond of eating. And my mother was afraid my brother was going to starve to death because of how little he ate. But then I came along and she had a different worry, and that was, can I get my left hand into the food while I'm feeding him with my right hand? And then get the left hand to his mouth while I can get my right hand into the food. That was her problem with me, just feeding me fast enough. And I'd been outside of baby food for a while, but I was still fond of eating. And if we found enough Coke bottles, we could go to the grocery store. It's now called Corner Market. Back then it was the Jitney Jungle in Fondren. We could go to the Jitney Jungle in Fondren and get money for the Coke bottles, and then we'd have enough to buy food. Now, this was new to me. I certainly had been told no before, many times, but I had never been told, no, we don't have any money. No, we can't do that because we don't have any money. That was new. And though it was 50 years ago, it marked me. Some of you may have had a similar experience where you didn't know if there was going to be enough food, and you went and scratched around for something you could sell or find and sell to have food. That may have been your life for a long time, but it was new to me. And it still affects the way I think and the way I feel, especially the way I feel. I wonder if there will be enough. For Jesus and the people who he ministered to, this was not unknown. They would be tenant farmers, perhaps, who owed the first part of any harvest to the landlord, and they'd have to get along on what was left after the harvest went to the landlord. For others, I think, including Joseph and Jesus and their family, Joseph is called a tekton. A tekton is a builder. Possibly that meant he was a carpenter for houses or furniture, but more likely he was a stone cutter or other kind of construction worker who was working on Herod's imperial city of Sepphoris. Sepphoris was a new imperial city, newly being built by Herod Antipas, a short walk, a relatively short walk from Nazareth. And if you were a tekton of that type, then you were a day laborer. If there was work that day, you got paid. And you used your pay to buy food. You and your family ate. If there wasn't work that day, you didn't eat. And you hoped for more days when you did eat than days you didn't. They were at the edge. The people Jesus ministered to were at the edge. He knew what it was like to be at the edge. He knew what it was like to live with scarcity. Now he's begun teaching, preaching, ministering to people, but he's encountered a crisis. The crisis brought on by the death of John the Baptist. It's now clear, if it wasn't before, that those who speak truth to power are vulnerable. Not just vulnerable to being silenced, but vulnerable to execution on a whim, or a foolish promise, or a drunken oath. What is his ministry going to be like? He may need to grieve for John. So he takes a boat and goes into the wilderness. But people follow him. His reputation precedes him and follows him to this deserted place along the Sea of Galilee. And Matthew tells us he felt compassion for the people. The Greek word means he felt their pain in his guts. He felt compassion. And he begins to help them, to do what he can for them. He pours himself out into service to them. And it's about to get dark. And his disciples say, "Send them away so that they may buy food in the villages." And he says, "No, I'm not going to send them away. You give them something to eat." And they respond with a sentence of scarcity. "We have nothing but 5 loaves and 2 fish." The important part of that sentence is, "we have nothing." They present a statement of scarcity. And he says, "Bring them to me." And they bring the loaves and the fish. And we see something that's almost like a Eucharistic prayer. He says, "Blessed are you, Lord God of the universe. You bring forth bread from the earth." And he passes the bread out. And I know what happened, but I don't know why it happened or how it happened. But in the middle of the wilderness, with a statement of scarcity, all ate, and they didn't just have scraps. All ate and were satisfied. And there were leftovers. There was an abundance. An abundance that begins when Jesus shows compassion for the people. We will often say, "I have nothing but," and then we may run down what our resources are. We may look at our resources and think, "I don't have enough. There isn't enough. There won't be enough. I've got to save what I have or there won't be enough." And I understand that. I feel that way sometimes. But Jesus comes to me and says, "You give them something to eat. You follow my compassion. And there is enough." When I follow Jesus in showing compassion, you'd think there would not be enough, but there is. There's enough. My mother was audited fairly regularly, or at least she got letters of inquiry from the IRS. It wasn't because she was dishonest. They would say, "Now this is your income, and you are claiming this much charitable contribution. That's not possible. We know how much someone with that income can give, and you couldn't possibly be giving that much to charity with your income. And then she'd have to show them the receipts. Yes, I gave that much. She said one time, my father-in-law needed to have coronary artery bypass surgery about a month before he turned 65 and was eligible for Medicare. And he didn't have health insurance. But the Baptist Medical Center made sure that it was taken care of. And she said, I am so glad I've given so much money to Mississippi Baptist, so that when someone in a situation like Raymond's comes in, it's taken care of. The abundance was born of compassion. There was enough, and people were satisfied. And when we show compassion, when we live our lives out of compassion, there's enough.